All over the internet, there are disgruntled parents who swear left and right that their children went no contact with them over small nothings. According to them, they were good parents. They were not abusive. Even other people in their life tell them that they were great parents. Their friends, their golden child, other estranged parents. Today I'm going to explain why I tend to be very skeptical of this narrative and how my belief is rooted in science. Specifically, I'm going to be breaking down a study that found a frightening percentage of abusive moms not only deny their abuse, but can also hide it when observed by a trained third party, even when there's been documented proof of their abuse and they know that the person doing the study knows of that documented abuse. After I break it down, I'm also going to share the real life implications of this study, and spoiler alert, they're not very pretty. So let's talk about the study in question. The study looked at different assessments' ability to identify moms who had a history of either physically or neglecting their child based on Child Protective Services, what's called CPS reports. And if you're not familiar with the CPS system, typically when CPS gets involved, things have to be pretty bad. CPS tries its very hardest to not split up families. It doesn't really take action unless there's an actual investigation and evidence of maltreatment. So for CPS to get involved, although it's not a perfect metric of abuse, I would say it's typically a pretty severe metric of abuse. So what are those different methods of assessment that the study wanted to look at? One was the Parent-Child Conflict Tactic Scale, called the CTSPC, which is a self-report questionnaire for parents, and based on the questions, it's meant to identify abuse and neglect. It assesses for things like threatening, yelling, neglecting. But the researchers talk about how faking good is a very real issue, meaning a lot of parents will try to answer in a way that makes them look positive because they don't want to be perceived as abusive, even on a self-report questionnaire. The second assessment that the study looked at was a brief observation during a non-stressful encounter where moms were meant to be teaching children how to complete a task. They did this because moms with a history of maltreatment have previously been shown to have low levels of positive behavior and involvement with their child during these third-party observations. And the people who were coding these observations were blind to whether or not the moms had a history of abuse based on CPS allegations, meaning they were not influenced by that knowledge because they didn't know if it was true of the specific person they were coding. They coded for 12 different parenting behaviors using videotapes, so they assessed for things like warmth, encouragement, negative feedback, intrusiveness, physical control. If there were any disagreements in their scoring of the videotapes, they would discuss them with a PhD level psychologist, and those differences would be resolved by consensus. And the inter-rater reliability for the scoring turned out to be quite good. It was 0.78 for positive parenting items and 0.93 for negative parenting items, which are considered good and excellent inter-rater reliabilities, respectively. The third assessment that they looked at was flat out asking moms if they've ever been referred to CPS. As you can imagine, this one is a little bit questionable because a lot of parents want to present in a positive way, and so in an actual face-to-face interaction, when somebody asks them, have you ever been accused of mistreating your child in some way? A lot of parents are going to say, nope. Previous studies estimate that around 21% of parents with an abuse history completely deny the abuse, and another 47% at least partially deny it, meaning a vast majority of abusive parents, around 68%, at least partially, if not fully, deny their abuse. And then the last assessment that they did in this study was the Parent Attribution Checklist, which looks at a parent's beliefs about their child's behavior. They wanted to look at this because parents who tend to blame their child for the abuse that they inflict on the child and who hold negative beliefs about the child have been shown to conceal their abusiveness more than parents who hold themselves responsible for what they've done. So the goal of this study was to examine whether moms with a documented CPS history of child maltreatment differ from controls, meaning people who do not have a history of CPS allegations, either on the self-report questionnaire or on the brief observation. Their hypothesis was that abusive moms would score higher on the self-report and show less positive and more negative behaviors toward their child during the observation of the mother-child interaction. The results would then be compared with the CPS records. Another goal was to assess whether the way parents think about their child has any correlation to whether or not they conceal their abuse. And their hypothesis there was that moms who conceal their abuse would be more likely to hold a child-blaming schema. The participants were mothers of 139 children. The children were between ages of 3 and 6 with an average age of 5, and 58 of those 139 moms had a history of child maltreatment according to CPS. But before we go into the findings of the study, sometimes I get questions about how I keep my hair and nails long, and one of the answers is collagen peptides. I stopped taking collagen peptides during pregnancy and breastfeeding simply because it was damn near impossible to actually figure out if all these different brands do heavy metal testing, and that wasn't something that I wanted to pass along to my baby. And the brands that I was using kept getting called out for having heavy metals in them, which is why I really want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Quince. Quince is an online shop for high quality clothing, home goods, accessories, and more recently they also launched a wellness line. And I was so happy to see that their collagen peptides are all third-party tested for heavy metals. I decided to give it a try, and I love how it just dissolves into my matcha latte. It's not clumpy like other brands of collagen that I've tried in the past. And in addition to collagen, it contains hyaluronic acid and vitamin C, plus no sugar or artificial sweeteners. I personally love taking collagen powder because it supports joint, nail, hair strength, makes your skin more youthful. But Quince's wellness line also has other options like their mushroom coffee or their daily multivitamin drink. I was also getting so excited looking through Quince's website because they truly deliver high quality items at a much more affordable price than other places. They have grade A Mongolian cashmere, but also buttery soft bamboo bedding, accessories, even lab grown diamonds. I got this gorgeous summer dress and it's made of natural fibers because I'm not buying any more synthetic materials. And I also got these white jeans for the summer. You might be wondering how in the world Quince is able to offer such quality products at an affordable price. It's because they work directly with manufacturers, which cuts out the middleman and means there's no markup. I will most definitely be using Quince again in the future. Click the link down below to give Quince a try. Alright, so back to the study. Let's talk about the findings. 28% of moms who had a CPS history of abuse concealed it. This number was higher for moms who specifically were reported to have neglected their child, and only about half of mothers who had mistreated their children were able to be identified using these assessments. That's pretty concerning. More on that in a second. In addition to that, abusive moms who acknowledged it did report higher scores on the self-report than non-abusive moms in the control group. However, this difference was limited to mothers who acknowledged a history of maltreatment, because there were also a chunk of abusive moms who rated themselves as equally unabusive as participants in the control group. Abusive moms who concealed their abuse rated themselves as similarly to people who were non-abusive, which led the researchers to the conclusion that the self-report that they administered, the CTSPC, has high specificity but poor sensitivity. High specificity meaning that presumably non-abusive controls were correctly classified as non-abusive, but poor sensitivity meaning that only 31% of abusive moms were correctly identified. So it seems like both giving people a self-report questionnaire and observing them interacting with their child are accurate for identifying unabusive moms, but not accurate for identifying abusive moms. Because of course, even abusers can fake good for a period of time or lie on a questionnaire as a way of appearing socially desirable to other people. And that is a huge barrier to actually assessing if they're abusive or not. Another finding was that moms who acknowledged their maltreatment history were more likely to blame their own parenting rather than the child. So going back to that hypothesis about like how moms think about their child and who's to blame for the abuse, there does seem to be evidence that if you blame yourself for the abuse that you've inflicted, you're less likely to conceal it, versus if you blame your child, you're more likely to conceal what you've done. There were a few limitations of the study, namely CPS allegations aren't a perfect index of maltreatment. It's also possible that some moms in the control group were abusive despite not having CPS allegations. It was a pretty small sample size, so this definitely needs to be replicated with a larger sample size. And the participants knew that it was going to be a study related to child maltreatment, so that could also have influenced their responses and their behavior. But let's talk about this. What are the real-life implications of the study? Those of us who are familiar with the way that abuse works are not going to be surprised by the findings of the study. Abusers find ways to deny their abuse even when there is documented proof of it. This is why I tend to be skeptical of people who deny it when their child makes an allegation of abuse in particular. You know, when we talk about other types of abuse, certainly it can be a little bit more complicated, but a child specifically saying that their parent abused them, they don't have a lot of incentives to lie about that. Children are literally programmed to adore their parents. They have so much history with their parents. Their parent was their primary attachment figure, ideally for the first however many years of their life. And so the idea that a child would just say, actually, you were to me, I don't want to talk to you anymore, you can't be a part of my life, out of the blue, is, in my opinion, is just not very likely. No one wants to identify as abusive. We all need to hold a positive view of ourselves to sort of survive in this world. It's virtually impossible to live with yourself if you accept that you are an abusive person and you sort of grapple with the shame that that elicits in you. So people find very clever ways to convince both themselves and others that they're not abusive. But the fact that a large chunk of abusive moms concealed their abuse suggests they know what they did was wrong. They know, for example, that, spanking a child or yelling at them, belittling them is considered abusive, and that's why they didn't admit to it on the self-report. They know that behavior is mistreating their child, they just don't want people to judge them for it, which suggests this is a little bit more insidious than the alternative, which is that people are also lying to themselves. I think it kind of goes back to that conscious, unconscious structure of the mind. Someone might consciously think that they're a good person, that they're not abusive, but even on an unconscious level, they know that what they're doing is wrong and not okay. Another takeaway of this article is that you can't really tell if someone is to their child based on just watching a brief interaction. And this is concerning to me because when I think about what are the different ways to assess for abuse, observing the parent-child dynamic to me seems like one of the best ways to do that because you actually see what's going on between those two people. But clearly that's not the case unless it's for an extended period of time, because people can fake good for a limited number of time, whether it means seeming like the best parent in the world for a short period of time when somebody is watching them, or whether it means, pretending to not be abusive to their partner when they're at a double date with friends, or whether it means pretending to not be abusive for the first 3 months of the relationship until they've reeled that person in and had them hooked. Not only can people hide their abusiveness for a limited period of time, but certain types of abusers, such as I would say those with narcissistic personality disorder, are actually masters at public perception and can even seem like the very opposite of the type of parent they actually are. They can even seem like glowing, stand-up, amazing parents, not just unabusive ones. It makes me think about family vloggers who pretend to be these wonderful parents and are praised by all their fans, and then behind the scenes we later find out years later they were horribly mistreating their children. That's why it's so tricky if, for example, a friend is coming to you and says, "Oh my God, my child estranged themselves from me." Your instinct might be to validate them, to say, no, I saw you guys interacting, you were not abusive, you were a wonderful mother. But the truth is that you don't really know what happened behind closed doors. You've only seen them interact in probably brief, limited settings. And those are settings where abusers are capable of hiding their abuse. Now, there is a silver lining to this, which is that clearly parents are capable of exercising self-control and not being abusive when they're being watched, which suggests that theoretically they could stop being abusive with the right interventions, that they have the capacity for it. But I'm doubtful that this would be feasible long-term because these parents don't seem to be so motivated by what's good for their children. They seem to be more motivated by how they come off to other people. Like Lundy Bancroft in his book, Why Does He Do That? He talks about how when he would work with intimate partner violence abusers, he thought it was curious how when they would go on violent rampages and start destroying pieces of furniture, they would only ever destroy their partner's belongings, not their own, and they were able to suddenly stop being abusive when the police was called. Abusers are capable of exercising self-control, of not being abusive. The issue is that they don't care about the victim's rights, they care about how they're being perceived. So do they have the capacity to stop being abusive? Yeah, of course. I'm just skeptical that they have the sort of personality structure that would motivate them to do that. Another takeaway of the study was that abusive parents who deny their are more likely to blame the child rather than themselves. Does this sound familiar to you? Estranged kids are narcissists. They're terrorizing parents with their boundaries. They treat us like a doormat. It's very common for abusers in denial to project their own unwanted traits and their own abusiveness onto their child. It's like, no, I wasn't abusive. It's actually my child, the one who had a lot less power than me, who literally had no rights growing up. That was actually the abuser. It wasn't me. Projection is basically offloading our feelings of shame. It's, I can't sit with this reality about myself, so I'm going to hot potato it onto somebody else so that I can get rid of the shame and suddenly feel good about myself. And this can really negatively impact the child because, as you can imagine, being told constantly growing up and then even as an adult, you're a terrible person, you're actually the abusive one, you're the one who has something wrong with their personality, you internalize that, especially when it comes from the people who are supposed to teach you self-esteem, are supposed supposed to hold you in high regard so that you internalize that high regard for yourself. You can imagine how that would result in people really starting to blame themselves for everything and in any situation, thinking, this must be my fault, I must be the problem, I'm actually the one who's toxic in X, Y, and Z way. This type of projection is actually a lot of what's behind DARVO: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender, which is where the abuser denies their abuse, attacks the victim, and flips it so that they are actually the victim and their actual victim is the abuser. A lot of DARVO is just projection. It's, I cannot sit with my own abusiveness, so I'm going to accuse you of being abusive instead. So I guess this study really has me reflecting in more of like a clinical setting. How do we identify abusive parents? If self-report is not a useful tool, if a brief observation is not a useful tool, how do we determine if parents are abusive or not? Personally, my rule is if a kid is saying they were abused, you trust the kid. Okay, like that is a huge accusation. Kids don't typically make it for no reason. The amount of accusations that end up being false is very, very low compared to the amount of abusers who end up getting away with it is very, very high. And like I said, people rarely ever accuse a parent of abuse or cut off a parent unless it's absolute torture to them to continue having that person in their life. So my rule of thumb is if a child is saying my parent abused me, I fucking believe them. But of course, there are situations where maybe a child was abused by a different parent and developed certain toxic dynamics themselves, and now maybe they are making a false accusation against someone who's innocent. How do we assess if that's what happened for sure? Maybe the answer is we don't just observe those kids interacting with their parents for a limited period of time. Maybe we do something much more extended, a much more extended observation where we actually get to see how they interact in the home, in their natural environment, or maybe how they interact at a weekend therapy retreat for parents suspected of abuse, or maybe watch them interact in a more high-stress context where parents are more likely to lash out at their children. Clearly, a brief observation just does not cut it because people can fake good for limited periods of time. And thinking about this outside the clinical sphere, thinking about it just like in day-to-day life, if you are suspecting somebody of abusing their child, you really gotta observe them for an extended period of time in their natural environment before you can assess if that's true, before you can rule out, oh, you know what, that's probably not what's happening here. So be very, very careful when parents tell you, I'm not abusive, I've never abused my child. If their child is stating something different or somebody else is stating something different, parents are highly incentivized to lie about that. Not such a fun study to talk about, but I think a really important one to discuss. Don't forget to check out Quince. I highly, highly recommend them. I will certainly be using them again very soon. And I hope you have a nice rest of your week. Tell me what you